We ended up with about 7 Kea come down into a caravan park right by the beach, and these birds just cause mayhem late in the evening and actually all through the night, particularly if it's a full moon. They can be very active. These birds were coming down in the late evening and just landing on people's caravan roofs, pulling out wires and rubber, and if people went outside and yelled at them, of course, that caused even more excitement for the birds.
Welcome to Saving Wildlife with me, Sam Williams. On today's episode we talk about Kea, an incredible parrot from New Zealand that's long been a favourite of mine. Because of that, I dove straight into conversations with Tamsin and failed to introduce it properly. We do get to it a little bit later on though. We've also got some fun video that I'm going to overlay on the YouTube channel episode. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, you might check out the YouTube and get to see these guys. It's also the first time I've done a virtual conversation, and that's a little bit different for me, but I think you'll find it went pretty well, and hopefully I'll be doing more of these in the future to reach more conservationists. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Tamsin, it's exciting for me to be talking to you today about Keas because they are my favourite of all parrots, and parrots are my favourite of all animals. And it's been more than 30 years that I've wanted to see one in the wild, and I still haven't made it there. They're such incredible characters. Let's start with some stories, because I imagine you've had incredible encounters with them in the wild.
Yeah, no, I've actually encountered Kea both in the wild and captivity. The captive group is actually when I first had my first experiences with them. And actually that still remains some of my most endearing encounters. I actually worked with 3 birds. 2 of them had been caught from the wild, so they were birds that had been brought in because they were seen to be attacking sheep up in the high country areas, which is actually a reason why they were subjected to a bounty for 100 years. And so at Auckland Zoo, where I was working, I started working with them, and it was because I'd read the book Alex, obviously about Alex the grey parrot, and and was absolutely fascinated with his abilities. And so I thought, well, I was going to try a few of some of the training sessions, I guess, that I used to use on carnivore species with the birds and see how well they responded to it. And I was absolutely blown away. So I actually started up a training system with these birds every day, and they literally would just nail new behaviours after just a few minutes. And they were obviously hanging out for that sort of stimulus all the time, and that's really what hooked me onto these guys.
Yeah, they're super smart, and they just pick up new things instantly, don't they? And but they're playful, and they experiment and explore different things all the time it seems.
Oh yeah, and of course that's what gets them into trouble at times in the wild. So we deal with a lot of conflict situations in the wild, and it's normally young teenage birds, basically. They fledge from the nest, and then they sort of get out there on their own. They develop these big flocks of young teenagers, basically sort of flying around everywhere, and humans are very interesting to them, and all the stuff that we bring along with us. And that's when we start getting the conflict situations, Kea breaking into houses and dismantling vehicles and all that sort of thing, which is sort of classic.
I think it's hilarious that everything we put in their environment they kind of make fun of. The interesting thing there, you said the 2 of those individuals were attacking sheep, and Kea got a lot of fame for that, or notoriety, because they would actually attack live adult sheep. And is it the bile that they were going for or something like that? There was
it's going. Yeah, it was going for the fat around the kidneys. And I mean, there's a lot of discussion back and forth about just how extensive this behaviour was. It does happen, but whether it happened to the extent that was said at the time. But the government did put a bounty on them, and 150,000 were recorded as being killed. So there would have been a lot more birds than that over that period of time, and essentially, potentially exterminated them from particular areas. But fortunately, they survived. But the last of the permitted shooting of Kea for that particular purpose was back in 2009. So it's pretty recent, even though they got full protection in 1986. So, but you could still apply for a permit to shoot Kea if they were causing issues.
And it's interesting that you've actually got that data of at least the minimum number that were removed. I mean, there's likely to be far more than that.
Yeah.
But when I think about my work with great green macaws, we don't actually know how many were there in the past. We can extrapolate from density estimates and things like that. But you've actually got a number, and so what's the population stand at now in the wild?
It's really hard. To get numbers just because of the fact that they're over such a massive area. It's nearly 4 million hectares, and a lot of that country is quite difficult to get into. We do have populations that ourselves and Doc and other researchers look at and monitor, and we've been doing that for many years now. So the best guesstimate's less than 7,000 individuals, which isn't a lot when you look at situations where they do crash. So we had a population up in Nelson Lakes, which is near the top of the South Island, and that was researched in the 1990s by Doc, and that population was seen to be stable during that period of time and not subject to predation events, which was interesting because they are a ground nesting bird. And we went back in there 10 years later just to get an idea of, was the population still stable? And we found it had crashed by almost 80% during that period of time. And that predation was actually a major issue. So we put nest cameras inside the remaining nests once we actually found where those birds were, because they hold their territory for their lifetime, essentially, breeding pairs. Yeah, so, and we just found that they were being constantly interfered with by a number of species, so all introduced mammals, because of course New Zealand doesn't have any land mammals other than bats.
We've gone straight in, I realise, because I'm like desperate to know what the latest is with the Kea. But let's step back a little bit. I was just thinking, because we said about New Zealand, people maybe don't even know what we're talking about. That's my fault because of my excitement to know. But the Kea is an alpine parrot from New Zealand. Can you tell us a bit more about the bird? Send us a postcard from where you would find the Kea.
Well, the Kea is not just an alpine bird species. It goes right down to the coastal areas. So we have birds hanging out on the beaches right down in the South Island. Getting into stuff, I should say, on the coast as well. So they live predominantly in the forested areas, and that's where they breed as well and nest. So they'll be sort of below the bushline. So nests can be as high as sort of 1,600 metres, but also right down to the coast. And the omnivorous bird species, so grubs and lots of seeds and fruits and nectars of native species. They also scavenge as well. They're quite a large bird species, so about 1 kilo. They're quite a sort of a grunty parrot, and the olive green feathers on the top make them very much camouflaged from above, which of course most of our species, because predators, they evolved in a system where the only predators really came from the sky. So like our Haast eagle, which is now extinct, which would have taken off your pet dog now, probably. They're so huge. And
the Haast eagle, the one that was like 17 kilograms and preyed on mowers?
Yeah. So you can imagine that would be pretty impressive to watch.
Amazing.
Yeah. I don't think people would have been very happy about having one of those flying overhead. So of course, a lot of our bird species, as a result, because predation came from the air and we don't have any mammalian predators in New Zealand naturally, a lot of them are ground nesters. So Kea are one of our ground nesting bird species. they're related to kakapo. So kakapo, kea and kaka are all related parrot species.
When they fly, though, they show off their colours then.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're incredibly bright under the wings. So you've got the beautiful oranges and yellows and, and this beautiful blue as well, an amazing blue sort of on the tails. And so they're quite spectacular when you see them flying in the alpine areas, particularly, with the snow. And they're brilliant flyers. So they'll catch the thermals up in the mountains and, just go straight up and over sort of the Southern Alps. So they're amazing to see flying in the snow.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And most people encounter them like in the alpine environment if they're like staying in alpine huts and things. I've heard stories of Keas sliding down the roofs of alpine huts and just all sorts of mischief.
Yes.
That seems to be the norm. But I'm amazed that they go down to the beach. I didn't realize they went all the way down that low. That's really interesting. So they're across a range of habitat. The forested areas where they're fine, is it podocarp trees?
Yeah.
Is that forest? Yeah.
Yeah, so the forests are normally they're associated very strongly with beech forest and rimu forests in the South Island. And they'll nest underneath either the roots of a lot of these trees in big cavities or rocks. So there'll be natural cavities that they'll use. And and those are the ones that we monitor.
Cool. And were they always only in the South Island?
No. So there's remains of Kea and kakapo up in the North Island. Yeah, so around sort of our cave systems up north. But they moved down basically with the last ice age. So they haven't been in the North Island for about 14,000 years or something.
Oh, okay. So it's not our fault.
No,
Okay.
that one wasn't. No.
That one, I like it. Yeah, well, we'll get into the various things that are our fault. I'm actually excited also to be talking about an island species because so far I've only had conversations with people working on larger continental land masses. Yeah. So it's cool because my beginning in conservation was on islands with Mauritius and all those typical problems. We'll get into those. So we've got Keas, we've got them in forest. I'm imagining that these pictures I've seen of New Zealand forest, they're really like lush, dense forests, and then going up into alpine environments with snow-capped mountains.
Yeah,
it's amazing that they're that adaptable, that they can cover all those different areas. Do you notice that different individuals in different places are doing different things? So are they like down at the beach they're doing more, or is it like an age thing, or is it like down at the beach there's birds that feed on this more and then up here they're feeding on that more, or is there a seasonal movement?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of questions around there about all of that. There's been some work done to show that there are lowland Kea versus highland Kea, and they do eat different species up there, but, between the different places, and potentially that, may impact on their physique in a certain way, sort of moving forward. But there's just a huge amount of movement also that goes on. And particularly when birds are juveniles, and they flock and then they move quite vast distances. So there's a lot of tracking work that's being done on them. We did some satellite tracking work on them back in 2009, and birds were, over a 2-day period, were moving 90 kilometres. So, yeah, they were doing sort of big... We were actually trying to catch this one bird to change the battery on the transmitter before it ran down. And so I was on a computer watching this bird tracking and on a radio talking to the field crew saying you just have to go over the next range, which of course is, you're scaling these massive peaks. And by the time they got there, the bird had come back around to where they were previously. So,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, so we never actually used it.
Oh, you're right. I'm amazed that you can even put a tracking device on them, because I'd have thought that their friends would just poke holes in it and destroy it. But are you using like a backpack, and how does it survive?
Yeah, well, it's one of those things that amazingly the backpack transmitters that we put on, they're very light obviously, and they have a long aerial that sticks out. The aerial has to be very, very strong, so if it's too flimsy, it'll just get snapped off. But amazingly, if it stays on within the first 24 hours or so, then they preen it into their feathers, and then it just stays on until the week. They have a weak link, and that'll
Yeah.
fall off generally after a couple of years, depending on the type of transmitter that they've got.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, because you just think of all the birds, Keas would be, the macaws are challenging because their beaks are so strong
Yeah,
and they just destroy things. But yeah,
yeah.
very cool. Well, there's lots of stuff that I want to come back to about the threats and the work, the amazing work that you're doing. But I'm kind of curious because you just said you were working in a zoo, but also you hinted at working with carnivores before. So what's been your path to where you are now leading this organization? Like from childhood even? Is there something that inspired you when you were growing up, or how did you end up here?
Oh, well, I'm probably like millions of other people who work with animals. I had a love of animals from day dot. I always wanted to be a vet, but I'm appalling at maths so, and chemistry, so that was never going to happen, unfortunately. But I did attempt 1 year of university, on the veterinary path before I realised that was never going to happen.
It's funny. It was too much blood for me. I wasn't into all the
Oh, okay.
internal stuff, but it like I guess when we were at uni school, it was kind of like vet was kind of the option if you were into animals. It was
Yeah.
that or a zookeeper.
Yeah, yeah, well, agriculture is a big thing over here as well if you're into animals, but of course a very different sort of way of looking at animals.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. So the 1 year at uni as a
Yes,
vet student,
yeah,
and
and dropped out really badly, and so went travelling, and then I had kids, and started developing a home, and I'd also been a zookeeper for a couple of years, so I worked straight after I left uni. I actually worked in the Lion Safari Park in Auckland, and that was a big open safari with about 23 lions and 4 tigers. So people would come, and drive through, and we'd have, yeah, and then you'd have a big line of cars, and you'd be standing in a cage feeding out the lions when they were all over the cage, and so that the classic sort of African safari type sort of thing in West Auckland, which sounds kind of strange, and it was like all of those zoos back this is in the 1980s, where they weren't very well managed. Animal welfare was a bit of a issue, and of course people would come to see cubs, and so there was a lot of breeding of animals and without much thought of where they would go afterwards. And
yeah,
all of that fortunately has stopped now in New Zealand. We don't have those sort of wildlife parks, or very few
yeah,
nowadays. Yeah, so that it was also quite, yeah, disheartening working in that system as well. But I did love working with the lions themselves, and of course you develop those very close relationships with them, particularly if you've hand raised them, which I hand raised
right. Wow.
cubs. But then I ended up doing all the other stuff, having a child and everything. Decided to go back to the zoo when my daughter was 10, and you had to go and study to get back into the zoo industry, because there were things like health and safety that you had to think about now, which you didn't previously. And so I went and studied at Unitec, which was more of an applied university situation. Got a placement at Auckland Zoo, and that's when I ended up on the native section. I got a job on the native section, and became exposed to these 3 Kea, and then I immediately switched. I realised that I actually wanted to focus on these guys, and I also wanted to make their lives better, I guess.
What,
And they weren't being kept that well at that stage.
what was it about the Kia that attracts you? Was it their intelligence or something
Yeah,
else?
Yeah, no, it's definitely their intelligence and also their history. So, like I said before, two of the birds have been caught from the wild and been brought in to, live the rest of their lives, and they're very long-lived parrot species. 50
Hmm.
years is, I think, the oldest in captivity, and these guys would have been between 15 and 30 at that stage. Um, Going from such a complex, environment like the South Island to being put in a small enclosure and then just essentially, forgotten. They're fed, and
Right.
all of those sort of basic needs are taken care of, but that stimulation is not there for decades. And it was when I started working with them, I started doing training techniques that I used on the large carnivores, that I realised just how much they were, they key into it immediately and they wanted more. And I realised that actually, it wasn't just these birds. There were, I think at that stage, there were about 100 Kea in captivity. And probably Auckland Zoo was one of the better situations to be in at that stage.
Right. I
So
think when they're so intelligent, it becomes all the more apparent of their need for enrichment
yeah,
and stimulation.
yeah,
And so, and I mean, all, I think of that in, you go, I remember going to Tenerife and there's orca in captivity. And because they're
mm,
so massive, you think about, well, these animals were swimming in, or if they were ever wild, they were swimming in oceans. And with little parakeets, you might not necessarily think about it that much because they're just lovebirds or something, but they still fly
yeah.
kilometers and kilometers and kilometers, and their environment in the wild is so rich. But when it's a Kea or an orca, it's just so in your face because they've got so much potential, and you realise how
Mm.
short our care can be of what they could have.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the zoos back in the day were all about, providing entertainment for people, and for people to be able to see them, and keepers, to be honest with you, had a million animals to get through each day, and you really didn't have, the ability to be able to spend a lot of time on one species.
Hmm.
And I mean, it's changed massively in New Zealand now, and which is great. But I realised at that time, which was 25 years ago now, that I had to go back and do some more study to find out, firstly, what was happening to all the Kea in New Zealand facilities, and then also, I guess, as part of that, to look at what was happening to them in the wild, because part of being a good zookeeper was about, advocating for the species that you hold in captivity, to advocate for their wild cousins. Um, and so that's what I did. So I ended up going around, not all the New Zealand facilities, but the majority of the all of the North Island ones, and then looked at the South Island ones to look at the different husbandry techniques that were happening, the different enclosure that birds were being held in, different social makeup of those birds, and then look at that against the behaviours that the birds were exhibiting. So, and particularly looking at the prevalence of stereotypic behaviours in birds, and
Yeah.
and Kea showed a very high degree of stereotypic behaviours, which was really concerning. As an
Mm.
indicator of welfare, poor welfare. That's pretty well known. So
It's interesting because I think an initial concerns about welfare, which is, I think, you know, during my, well, I'm sure it's gone longer, but I think there's been dramatic change over the past 30 or 40 years, where initially I think the focus was all about physical and
mm,
the mental component. There's an interesting comparison here where also like with humans, there's an increasing awareness of mental health since the pandemic. Um,
yeah,
it's like that awareness and the need for enrichment has come after getting the physical component
mm.
sorted early. Um, yeah. So what was the jump? What led to? Did you go directly from zoo involving Keas to then to the non-profit sector, or was there a stepping stone there?
No, pretty much straight from there. So I finished my degree in 2005, and as part of my research, I looked at what was happening to Kea in the wild and what sort of conservation measures were happening, and recognised that there wasn't a lot. And that, I mean, there were some great people doing some, great work, but it was, little bits here and little bits there, and no one really had a big picture of what was happening with the species. And it was clear from, talking to people that, people had concerns, and they weren't being, addressed. So 3 other people came along with me in 2006, so the next year, in February, we started up the Kea Conservation Trust, and that was so that we could get charitable status, and therefore we could apply for funds to then research what was happening in the wild. And so we managed to secure our initial lot of funding to look at 3 different populations in the South Island. So the first one that I mentioned in Nelson Lakes, that had previous data that we could go back to and compare, and then another population in Arthur's Pass in the Hordern Valley. Yep, everyone knows Arthur's
Everyone
Pass.
knows that one.
Yeah, if you want to see Kea, that's a great place to go. And then another southern location down in the Borland Valley in Fiordland, which is quite a wilderness area. And
Lord of the Rings is what comes to mind with Fiordland.
oh yeah, I mean it's just stunning country down there.
Yeah.
Um,
So
so
you say you applied for funding, and the situation in New Zealand might be slightly different. But if I'm kind of curious to know how did you make that jump, and how did you make that jump, and was it an easy transition to get the organization going, or was there some challenge?
it was a challenge.
Yeah. Okay. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, and it was a big learning curve as well. None of us had ever, had anything to do with, starting an organisation like that. And also, people were very sceptical about who we were, because, to be honest with you, we were all based in Auckland at that stage. I'm originally from the North Island. And we even had people who were concerned about the fact that some of our group were from overseas. So one of our founding members is from South Africa, another from England, and then there were 2 of us that were Kiwis. And because also 3 out of the 4 of us had zoo backgrounds, that was even more concerning. So we actually had one of the key conservation groups in New Zealand here start sort of talking that maybe we were setting up the trust so that we could poach Kea and sell them. So we actually had to have meetings in the South Island with this particular group to assure them that that's not what we were doing. And it took quite a while to build up that trust.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not something, I think it's a classic story of seeing a need, having a desire to make something better and a passion to do it. And you never think about that your credibility is going to be called into question.
Yeah.
So it's fun to hear that story, to know that thing. And then the big thing that also, when you're in that enthusiastic stage of we're going to change this thing, is the money. So how did you get money?
Well, yes, that was a big challenge. It took us a couple of years to secure our first funding, and so it was quite demoralising. My work while all of this was happening as well, I obviously left the zoo situation, and I was actually working for another not-for-profit in the fundraising side of things. So it was actually a community reforestation project in Auckland at that stage. And so I learned, some of the skills of fundraising and who to approach and how to approach and funding applications, etc., which was really valuable. And we applied for lotteries funding at the time, but you actually have to be able to have already secured your, half of the money that you need. which is just a massive call. And fortunately, we had a lovely couple of philanthropists in the South Island who loved Kea, who helped us out. And so they gave us that first seed funding, which then enabled us to go to the lottery's funding, match it, and we managed to raise $90,000. And yeah, and then that gave us our 3 years funding for those 3 sites, which kickstarted everything, which is great.
It's amazing that you get those philanthropists that see the opportunity and their support makes tremendous, changes everything basically.
It does, yeah.
But I like also the sort of the reflection on the fact that we get into this stuff because we love the animals and we want to make things better for them, and then find that we're doing, non-profit work is fundraising and is running an organization and is dealing with operations and all this other stuff. That when you were at the beginning and you just love the animals, you don't think about any of that. No. You don't realize what you're getting yourself into.
No, not at all. I actually think that if you did, a lot of people would be completely put off, and wouldn't actually go there, because it's, as you say, it's all about the animals to start with, and you realize actually to get to that point, you've got to pull in an awful lot of other people and, be able to get that idea and that enthusiasm across to other people. And that's hard. It's hard work.
Yeah. So what do you think? I mean, I've seen people that haven't made that transition, and I've seen people that are struggling and are kind of not giving up, but not really able to make the transition either. What do you think has been useful attributes for you that has helped you go from just I love Kea to now running a successful organization with a fantastic group of staff?
I think, well, a lot of it has been recognition of having to connect with these communities and recognizing that, things may not happen straight away, that it takes time, to build trust, obviously, for a start, and also sometimes for that idea to take seed and grow. And so what we did actually from 2008 onwards, so before we got our first lot of funding, was that 2 of us from the trust would come down every year to the South Island. And that was the other thing, because we were North Island based. It was quite difficult to sell, to all these South Island communities who were living with the birds and therefore had developed those relationships to have, North Islanders come in. And we'd travel around the South Island for a couple of weeks and have meetings with communities, to see what they needed, and what were the challenges for them and how we could help them, because, potentially we could help raise funds to support some of the work that was already happening, or did they want to see some work happening, or did they want, for us to completely leave them alone? And we were also working with the zoos as well at that stage, so trying to get sort of, the word out there and get people talking, because I think that's one of the main things is it's very difficult to get things off the ground until you've got people actually talking about it and considering it in their own time, and then coming back to you on their own time as well. And then, of course, along the way, we connected up with those people that were doing, some great work, and learning ourselves what, was being done, or the gaps in information. And then we focused research on filling those gaps at that stage.
Yeah. So we mentioned first island species on the podcast. Let's talk a bit about the threats that they're facing, because I think it's very interesting to look at islands, and because the pattern is so consistent around the world. I know on the website you've got a list of the main threats, and I was kind of actually surprised to see that mammalian predators is top of the list, isn't it? That's right. I'm right in thinking that's top of the list, and the ambition is. But New Zealand takes a stance on predators, and is it aiming to be predator free by 2050? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, and there's been a huge drive on that. So, yeah, it was initially led by the government, and a lot of communities have stepped up and are involved in predator free activities, which is great. So it's just one of those sort of, it's a normal conversation to have, about what you've been trapping and how
Yeah.
you're trapping and all the rest of it. And it's fantastic because it's a recognition that we're losing our species at a rapid rate because of these introduced species, which of course came in during that whole colonisation of New Zealand, and rabbits were brought in for food essentially, and furs and everything, and then they got out of control, and so you bring in ferrets to control the rabbits, and then they get out of control, and so the story goes, and it's been seen, as you said, a million times before on different islands. So we're now kind of overwhelmed with all of these introduced predators, and feral cats is another major one,
Yeah.
which is really a tough one to deal with as well.
What I find interesting is the fact that this normality that you mentioned, where it's understood that nobody, no normal person enjoys killing species, killing animals, but it's a necessary step to protect the native wildlife. And so you mentioned a couple of species. You mentioned ferrets and feral cats, but there's other predators. Can you list off the predators, and if it, I assume it's at the nesting stage, but if there's some other stage that they impact Kea?
Yeah, well, they impact all stages. We get foraging birds, so as soon as they land on the ground, they're at risk of predation. So feral cats are a major issue for Kea. That's sort of been steadily increasing over the years, just with people, releasing their domestic cats and then them breeding and then becoming feral populations. Stoats are a massive issue, so stoats would be right up there with feral cats. And
stoats, the stoats are a mustelid. They're like a weasel, but are they bigger than a weasel,
they're
or
bigger than a weasel but smaller than a ferret. So so there's three mustelid species which are a major issue. So ferrets being the larger ones, they tend not to be such an issue because they like sort of open grassland areas and they're sort of lower down. Stoats are everywhere, and they're the ones that can take down any of our bird species. And then weasels are really small.
they do have weasels?
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
Weasels,
right, yeah, yeah. They're actually kind of cute. If
yeah.
they're not eating the native birds, they're a cute little rabbit.
Exactly. And I think this is the thing, is all of these species are great in their own,
Yeah,
ecosystems. They're
yeah.
in a balanced sort of harmonious relationship with everything else that's evolved around them. But yeah, we just, unfortunately, New Zealand was not a great place for them to.
No, they're not to be there. Not meant to be there. In addition to those guys, rats and mice.
Yeah, yep. So rats and mice. Rats tend to predate on eggs, but also for any other bird species, rats and mice are a nightmare. And possums as well. So possums were brought over for the fur trade. They wreck our native forests, but they also take eggs, interfere with nesting birds, and take over cavities and everything in the ground. But they also take chicks as well.
Right, right. And then often we don't think about the impact these species have. You mentioned it, the possums impacting the forest, but mice and rats are also seed predators.
Yes,
When
yeah.
so they affect forest regeneration as well. That's quite a suite of antagonists there. That's a lot for any species to try and survive with all of those coming after you.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, right. So there's a variety of work that's going into the removal of these invasive species.
Yeah.
But then you've got this really complex challenge where the Keas, with their interest and their interest in novelty, are also sometimes getting affected by the control of these predators, right? Can you
Yeah.
tell us what's going on there?
Well, yeah, that's a huge challenge because they are so inquisitive. Anything new in their environment, they'll check out. And we don't do pest control ourselves because it's just such a specialist area and it's incredibly expensive as well. But there is a lot of groups that do, which is fantastic. And without it, we'd have Kea extinct as well as pretty much every other species. But yeah, Kea do have a habit of getting into particularly ground-based pest control tools. So traps, bait stations, that sort of thing is a real challenge. So we've actually developed a document along with some specialists in the area. So with Doc and with some other groups that work specifically in that area to look at particular devices and how they can be Kea proofed. And that's a challenge because what you tend to find is that one trap that Kea into in one area, they definitely are in another area and they're getting caught in them. And so the levels of Kea proofing on some traps in some areas is just, off the scale.
Right.
Is
there something where you can put the traps out, but don't set them? And then the Kea kind of get bored of things if it doesn't prove interesting in the first couple of times they look at it?
Yeah, so that's a big one, and there's been quite a bit of work actually that's been happening in the Matuki Valley, actually, just over from where I am. I'm based in Queenstown, and the Matuki's over in Wanaka. And that's a site that we've been involved in since 2016, and a number of other groups who are involved in pest control also work in the same valley, which is great. And whenever new devices are put out, they'll lay them and not set them for an extended period of time. The only problem, of course, is that every single year you get a new cohort of young birds coming through. So it's all new again. And
Right.
and you may have one individual that starts getting into traps, and particularly if they're lured, so if they've got some sort of an attractant for the target species, then Kea potentially might be interested and see it as a food source. And then everything has to be unset again until that bird's sort of moved on.
Wow. Wow. It's a challenging species to protect. But
Yeah.
these cohorts, and this kind of leads to the next threat, these cohorts of juveniles that are going around, are they just kind of roaming around looking for trouble? And do they continue to do that for a number of years before they sort of, do they get pair off and then get business-like when they got chicks running?
Yeah. Yeah, it's just sort of like, a bunch of teenagers, zipping around everywhere and just trying everything out and pushing the limits. And yeah, and unfortunately if there's something to get into, there's likely to be, at least one of them get into it. So one of the other major threats we've got is lead poisoning, and that's
Right.
specifically to do with, interacting with anything that they can manipulate, and lead's very soft on buildings, and then ingesting it because it's sweet as well. And we've
Sweet.
found in areas like Arthur's Pass village, which has a whole pile of old buildings which are riddled with lead, that we were getting all the young juvenile males in particular with lead levels right through the roof.
Right.
Mm.
Right. So that's the flashing on the roofs. Is it also nails as well?
Yeah. So the nail heads, the old nail heads. So we've actually gone through, we've been working with the community over the last 3 years or so now, and Arthur's Pass is pretty much lead free now, which is fantastic.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we removed lead from over, I think, 110 properties in there now, so that's pretty much everything. And we've just been in actually doing some more lead surveillance. So what we do is we actually identified particular areas, and Doc also does this work, where you catch some banned birds, but then you also take blood and test them for lead levels. And Arthur's Pass was always through the roof. No pun intended. And then when we've just gone back in literally in the last couple of weeks, after removing all of the lead from the buildings, the lead levels are low. They're still there, but they're very low, which is the first time
Fantastic.
ever that we've had that result.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that just to understand that fully, that's a new group of birds that are just not as exposed, because once they've got it in their system, they can't get rid of it, can they?
No, but what happens is when we blood lead test them, we only get a window of about 3 weeks that it's circulating in the blood before it gets deposited in the bones and organs. So we can tell if they're being exposed to it at that period of time.
Right.
Yeah. To get longer exposure, then you'd look at the feathers or the bones or the organs, and obviously we can't get the bones or organs unless the bird's dead.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great success then. That's really, you can see the impact of the work, which is a nice thing in conservation that you turn it around that quick. It's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Well, it is, and it's. I mean, we're sort of, very cautious about that at this point in time, because what we've found in the past is that then birds will find another source and then we'll get the levels going up. But it's a really good, way to find where those sources are, and
Right.
and that they actually still exist. One of the other things that we're doing with this research is we're working with DOC and Otago University in this situation, is we get the samples of not only bloods but feathers, and then the samples of building material and ammunition that's been used and that contains lead, and then we can get an idea if these birds have lead poisoning, where that source is coming from. And so in some areas it's very much coming from ammunition, so lead shot, versus buildings.
And is lead shot still a standard thing for guns there? Because in California, where there's California condor
Yeah.
and other states, they're moving away from lead and to other I don't know, other materials. So
Yeah. Well, that's what we're hoping that will happen here.
right,
Yeah, but as you can imagine, it's very much, you know, it's a slow process, in that for the public, what's available for them to buy, firstly, in the shops, you need to have that legislation in place, and you also need to have those alternatives available for them as well, and the awareness that it is an issue.
yeah. In the last few minutes, we've just covered a whole range of things there, and I want to just ask: do you now consider yourself a roof specialist? Do you know things about roofs that you never expected to know about? I imagine you do.
Well, yeah, not me personally, but yeah, we've definitely got members of our team which know everything about washers and yeah, screws and different types of alternatives to lead. So yeah.
But you even know they exist, which is a start, like more than I do. So it just entertains me, because I think it's like, well, okay, so you love parrots, and the key, and then you find yourself like learning about roofing and
Oh,
lead, and
yeah.
then you're talking about outreach to about lead shot, and then you're talking about legislation to change that. So it's just how diverse conservation is, and how many
Yeah.
different things you have to suddenly know about to move the needle.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and then we were talking about predator control before that. So that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And that links sort of into the next thing, where Kea, or at least historically, and maybe I think still now, have been considered a nuisance.
Yeah.
This inquisitive nature of us gets them into trouble. And imagine if you've got animals pulling open your trash cans, or pulling your roof apart, or whatever, or dismantling your car, that can get pretty tiresome pretty quick, I imagine. And you
Yeah.
talked about the bounty. What are the sort of contemporary challenges that you find? How do Kea annoy people these days?
Well, yeah, it still goes on, unfortunately. We have a lot of conflict situations, and yeah, they tend to, well, they happen every year. We'll get sort of a new cohort of young birds coming through, and being very mobile. They move around everywhere, and then they just go and check everything out. And one of the classic situations we had, and this was years ago, it's one of our first conflict situations, was up in Kaiteriterri at the top of the South Island, a little beach community. And we ended up with about 7 Kea come down into a caravan park right by the beach. And so there were kayaks there and caravans and everyone enjoying the summer sun and all the rest of it. And these birds just caused mayhem over a period of months, pretty much. And so we actually got called in with Department of Conservation, and we held a big community meeting there because the birds would come down. And the interesting thing about Kea is their main periods of activity, they're sort of more of a crepuscular species, late in the evening and actually all through the night, particularly if it's a full moon. They can be very active, yeah. And then in the dawn again, they tend to, when it gets warm, they tend to sort of just, chill out a little bit more. But these birds are coming down in the late evening and just landing on people's caravan roofs, pulling out wires and rubber, and if people went outside and yelled at them, of course, that caused even more excitement for the birds. So they don't get scared away.
They're excited. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and there are dogs yapping around everywhere at the birds, which of course the birds thought was fantastic. And the community, interestingly enough, were quite divided. It divided the whole community. We had people who loved the birds and were really excited that they were there, and then there were other people who wanted to go out and, get rid of them. And so we had a meeting in the local pub, which I'd never advise doing. Actually, if you've got people who are quite emotional about things, it's not probably the best place to have a meeting. And we would have it was close to 60 people there, so it was a decent group of people. And in the end, we decided to actually catch those birds up with Doc and move them. And it was only just because, there were, threats to the birds at that particular point in time. And the caravan park was had lost everyone pretty much.
They'd lost business because of the Keas.
Yeah, they were losing a lot of business. People were just leaving.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So conflict is still an issue now. So you're coming in trying to keep the peace and raise awareness with people that are impacted?
Yeah, it's quite different now. So that was one of our first major incidents, and it was a big learning curve, sort of the recognition that you had to take people seriously. For us, of course, it was like, well, they're a bird, and this is going to be a transitional situation, and they will move on. But actually they can cause a lot of damage in the interim. And so we've actually now set up at that point in time, so that was back in 2014, we actually set up a program to deal with conflict situations, and that runs today. And we go in, one of the first things we do is we go in and we talk to the people involved. If it's a large group of Kea coming in a big issue, like it might be in a forestry situation where birds are coming in damaging big, earth moving or logging equipment, having a go at hydraulic, tubing and wiring and all that sort of thing. So it's a real health and safety issue as well. We had one lot of Kea that came through and caused about $30,000 worth of damage in a night. So those situations we have to take seriously. And then we'll go in with the crews and we'll catch and ban those birds so that we can then start monitoring how they're moving, and the crews get to know who the birds are and they can alert us to a situation.
Right. And
what we found was that these crews were actually, in the communities who were involved, actually started to identify with the birds, and they were named, these birds were named, so they could say, Bob's coming in and causing mayhem, and they actually develop a relationship with them. And all of a sudden we had forestry setting up guidelines to change the way they operated when birds came in. And it was fantastic. We were actually, now we've got these big research projects in the forestry areas, and we've got one happening at the moment which has spanned numerous years, looking at how Kea utilise the plantation forestry, versus native forests.
Yeah.
and then looking after those birds that use those areas for nesting as well. So they'll actually stop all activity in an area where birds are nesting, which is, yeah, a massive, it's fantastic to see.
Do you attribute that? I mean, New Zealand has a remarkably high level of support for conservation, just among the general public. I think it's got to be, as a nation, it's got to be world leading. I think in I've seen stats of like 90% of people care for wildlife. I mean, of course, how that translates to action is different. But do you attribute that to this acceptance by and support by the forestry, in part to that, or do you think it's because Kea are so likable and once you get to know them, do you think that could be a factor, or what is it that, I mean, it led to this remarkable shift?
Well, I think it's a little bit of all of that, but I think it's really just that sort of inherent, need for people to connect with nature, and just not having the opportunity to do it or knowing how to do it. So if you give them the opportunity to do it, like, normally conservation is something that people do over here, and it's, greenies that do it, and they're all a bit boring. But when actually people are doing it, in these situations where this is just normal life, people are getting on and doing their work or living their lives and everything, and then you get our team in Doc would go out and we'd catch these birds up, and they get the opportunity to handle these birds while we're banding them and taking bloods and everything. And they get up close and personal. It's wonderful. It's just, those sort of opportunities are gold. And I think it's really important to include those communities into those experiences so they can get a little bit of, the buzz that we all get on a daily basis.
Well, we do working with parrots. One of my first conversations was with Rocio, who works with Andean cats, and she's seen one once in 22 years.
Wow.
I can't imagine that kind of level of dedication.
No.
But that's why parrots are amazing, because we get this, they're so visible and loud, and
Exactly.
they're great.
Yeah.
So that's an example of where a conflict situation has been resolved in a really positive way. Are there examples where people take matters into their own hands and get rid of Kea? Does that still happen as a problem? I mean, there was as a nationally supported program 100 years ago or whenever it was, but even now, is there still a threat from these nuisance birds that get kind of banged on the head?
Yeah, and there's occasionally we have prosecutions as a result. So Department of Conservation will prosecute people for shooting Kea or killing them in some other way. It does still go on, unfortunately. Fortunately, now I think people will call, this sort of behaviour out. Whereas, particularly in small communities, things either get covered over and we don't talk about it, or people will go, actually, no, this is not, appropriate behaviour, and they call them out. And I think we're getting more of that now, where people actually stand up and become advocates for the birds. So, yeah, that's great to see. It's still sad that, that has to happen, that people are still going out there and, doing this to the birds. But it's really good that people are calling them out. One of the interesting things we have is we have an education program that's been going on for a long time now, but is now in a more formal situation, that we have a school teacher going around and doing a roadshow and talking to some of the smaller communities. And when you go into these communities and you're talking to children, you get a really good gauge of how the community feels about Kea, because of course little kids are going to, mirror what they're hearing at home and everything. And so you'll get quite a mix of discussions that are going on with these little children. And then, of course, it's very easy to then, provide them with the right information that they can then go home to their families with. And so we find quite strong shifts that are happening in communities, when we do that as well, because you reach out to the children who then become advocates for the birds and recognise that, what they're hearing maybe does need to be questioned sometimes, which is good.
Yeah, brilliant. So we've covered a range of different threats there. Is there any others that are significant for Kea?
Well, I mean, lead poisoning and predation would be, two of the major issues. Conflict, obviously. I mean, there's sort of the incidentals like vehicle strike. Yeah, and that's mainly because, of course, birds are encouraged onto roadways by people feeding them, and feeding is one of the key threats as well. And that's one of the things that we're trying to work with communities to actually keep Kea wild and not to encourage them into these areas.
Right. I think I've seen signs of like, don't feed the Kea. There's
Yeah.
That's interesting because you think of that with like bears,
Yes.
but I didn't really think about that as that attracting Kea into a trap where then they're going to get hit by a car, basically.
Yeah.
It's really,
The feeding of Kea actually is the root of all of conflict situations. I think in every single conflict situation that we've gone to, and when we actually sort of, talk back to why are the birds there in the first place, we find that people are feeding them. Right. Whether inadvertently, like they're feeding their pets outside, or, they happen to have a great veggie garden that the birds can get into, or whatever, compost heap, whatever. Feeding is always at the root of it. And the same with lead poisoning. You feed the birds, they then don't spend their time up in the mountain tops or the herb fields, or where it might be, foraging for themselves, which takes a long period of time. They're full of chips and pies and all the rest of it. And then they start sort of, mucking around on people's roofs and getting into lead and all the rest of it.
You said that lead is sweet. Does that, so that when they eat it, there's that kind of reinforcing the eating of lead? Is that? Yeah, it's interesting that I never really thought about lead being tasty.
No, and I mean, I personally don't know that it's sweet. This is only obviously what I've been told. But yeah,
you have it that you have.
No, but apparently it's sweet, but also it's very malleable, so the birds can easily manipulate it. They rip off great big chunks, and actually when they go to the wildlife hospitals to get tested and x-rayed, they can actually see big lumps of lead inside them, which of course then gets absorbed, into the bloodstream, and and they need treatment. So there's a couple of great wildlife hospitals in the South Island, the South Island Wildlife Hospitals in Christchurch, and so that gets a lot of the birds coming through, and they do chelation therapy on the birds to try and flush this lead out of them. Yeah.
Oh, really? Wow.
Very expensive and long process for the birds.
Yeah, I bet that's, I mean, it's, very involved. Wow. So, you're talking about how feeding of Keas attracts them to different places, but then you mentioned veg gardens and compost heaps, which I never really thought about feeding. Are there Kea-proof things that are normal in New Zealand that would be bizarre for me if I was to arrive? Like that I mean, it's kind of hard to ask you because they're normal to you, but like in the States and Canada, you go places and there's bear-proof garbage bins, rubbish bins. Are there things like that in place in New Zealand that the systematic change because of Kea?
Yeah, rubbish bins are a big one, and so they need to be weighted lids, and so they'll actually have a weight sort of attached to the inside of the lid. So, because of course you have the rubbish trucks coming along picking them up, and then they need to actually shut and stay shut. People used to put, weights on the top.
So did the Kea then push the weights off the bins?
Yeah, and you can actually see some really great footage if you Google of Kea doing that in Mount Cook, so Aoraki Mount Cook. And it's
Right.
amazing. You've got a 1 kilo parrot essentially being able to push its body weight or more off these bins. So they can be very
Brilliant.
persistent when they want to.
We will link to some videos in the show notes, and if
Mm.
I get some media, we'll insert some media in this conversation.
Yeah.
So, Kea Conservation Trust started in 2006. It's been growing for 20 years.
Hmm.
During that time, what has been the highlight for you? What's been something you're most proud of the success for your team?
Oh, well, there's so many moments really. I think being accepted by these communities and some of the work that's come out of it that was completely unexpected. So, communities getting behind us and then taking whatever we've started further, is always great. And the forestry is a great example of that, where we started in a conflict situation, and then those birds have now become very precious to them, which is fantastic. I think also the lead removal project, that's a really exciting project because unlike predator control, which is ongoing, and which is, as soon as you stop doing anything, they'll come back en masse and cause issues. As soon as you get rid of lead from the environment, it's gone for good. And
Yeah,
yeah, and I mean it's massive because the South Island's huge, and there's huts right in the outback areas, but there's also all of these small villages and containing huge amounts of lead. And it's been a process of getting communities on board because often if you say we're coming in here, this project is free to you, we just need access to your buildings, it's actually hard to sell something that's free, because people always think that you know there's a hook in there somewhere that eventually they are going to have to pay, and it truly is a free
right.
project for them. So
Yeah,
getting people on board, and then seeing that enthusiasm, and then the success when we start blood lead testing birds, and we're actually finding that the blood lead levels have dropped massively. That's super exciting. The other
yeah,
thing is that every 2 years we have a Kea Summit, and that's bringing everyone together. So there's ourselves, Department of Conservation, local iwi, universities, researchers. We also have people coming from overseas as well. We've had a number of the zoos, Cincinnati Zoo, Denver Zoo, coming in and presenting at our conferences. Our captive holders over here, so all of the zoos come as well. And it's a really fantastic opportunity for all of us to share the challenges that we've got, ask those hard questions in a group that's safe, and we all work towards solving those challenges and those really critical questions about conservation. And then that sort of gives us all the enthusiasm and those connections as well, and that massive networking opportunities to go out for the next 2 years and go and do our stuff and then all come back together again. So yeah, they're
yeah.
fantastic opportunities.
Fantastic. Yeah, really, really good. Okay, last question, because I love that we're ending on high. The thing about the 20 years and the successes, the remarkable successes you've had. I think in such a relatively short amount of time, because we didn't mess it all up in 20 years. It took a lot longer. Um, what do you see in the next 5 to 10 years for Kea Conservation Trust? What are some of the big things on the horizon for you?
Well, recently the Kea Recovery Group has been developed, so that's a lot of our native species have recovery groups that Department of Conservation put together. And
Hmm.
the Kea Recovery Group started up a couple of years ago, and we have representatives from Department of Conservation, from Tahu, which is the local iwi here, and also from the Kea Conservation Trust. And the great thing is that we all get together, all looking through different lenses, obviously, and have developed a whole range of projects. So there's 50 plus projects that have been identified as needing to be worked on. So they might cover education advocacy or monitoring or pest control or also connecting, through Mātauranga Māori as well. So actually, everyone being able to partner up and have a voice in there. And then we all go off and we, then drive, the different parts that we take on. So the Kea Conservation Trust is specifically looking at education advocacy, plus some of our monitoring sites as well, the lead removal and that sort of thing. And because we've all got different strengths, we can then maximise the work that's happening. So I think having that really key partnership between us and DOC and iwi, so not just Ngāi Tahu but Te Tau Ihu, which are 7 smaller iwi at the top of the south, gives a lot more power, I think, for care conservation initiatives to happen. And so I see that, that's going to really help, coordinate and drive care conservation initiatives over the next 5-10 plus years, which is great.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing position to be in, to have that amount of support, that everybody's pushing in the same direction.
Yeah.
It's very enviable. I think it sounds fantastic. And I hope that within 5 to 10 years I get myself out there to see it for myself. And I think it's just amazing what you and the team have done. And thank you so much for your time today, for everything you do for my favourite parrot.
Thanks. No, really good to talk to you.